There was a stretch of my career when I traveled 50 weeks out of the year, 50 weeks out of the year to speak to business owners. And all of that speaking created a problem. It was a great problem. I was delighted to have it. Also was a problem. People kept coming up afterwards wanting to buy something, and I didn't have anything to sell them. So we built a product, for lack of a better term. It was a $40,000 2-day strategy assessment. I would fly to wherever the CEO or founder was, and we'd lock ourselves in a conference room with their leadership team. We sold two or three of those every month, and they almost always led to retainer work. It was a great but exhausting business development strategy. And with the exception of maybe 3 or 4 clients, they did end up putting us on retainer. It worked incredibly well. The workshop followed a very deliberate order that was interesting to every founder and CEO on the planet. Day 1 had nothing to do with marketing. It was the business, the team, the goals, the revenue model from which growth was actually supposed to come. I dug deep, and some of the questions I asked were purposefully uncomfortable. Day 2 then was marketing and communications, where we looked for the holes in the low-hanging fruit. By the end, the client had an action plan they could execute themselves, or more likely, hire us to run. It worked 99.9999999% of the time. The exception was an entrepreneur here in Chicago. I remember being thrilled I didn't have to get on a plane. I just had to jump in a lift. About 90 minutes into day 1, he was visibly irritated with my questions. So I called an early break to check in with him. And he lit into me. I mean, lit into me, yelling F-bombs, told me I didn't know what I was doing and that he didn't want his team in the meetings. When I asked how he'd like to spend the remaining day and a half, he canceled the whole thing with a few more expletives for the road. I went back to my office. I was so upset, and I refunded every penny. I wanted nothing to do with him or his money. For years, I told that story as a lesson about walking away from bad clients. But here's a bigger lesson in it, and it's the reason I'm telling it to you now, right as mid-year budget reviews are landing on everyone's calendars. He didn't blow up at my marketing questions. We never even got to those. He blew up at the business questions because he couldn't or didn't want to answer them in front of his team. And without the business conversation, the marketing conversation was worthless. There was nothing to attach it to. That's why I gave him his money back. And here's what that means for you. When you walk into a budget meeting armed with impressions, reach, and a beautiful coverage report, you're doing the same thing he did, politely, without the F-bombs, but you're still refusing the business conversation. And the CFO can't fund what never attaches to the business. On this week's FinSucks podcast, we'll talk about how to show up for the business conversation so you can win the marketing one.
If you're a communications pro who works hard, doesn't compromise quality, and gets the job done, welcome home. We'll share our tips, tricks, and stories, and together we will change the face of PR. Spin sucks, but we don't. With the Spin Sucks podcast, here's Gini Dietrich.
Welcome back to the Spin Sucks podcast. I'm Gini Dietrich. Before we get started, I have a little tidbit for you. Did you know that if you can't finish watching right now, you can subscribe to the audio version of the show? We're on all the platforms where you get your podcasts, including Spotify and Apple. Or you can subscribe to our newsletter at spinsucks.com and receive it in your inbox personally from me every Tuesday morning. Let's talk about the environment that you're walking into because it's rougher than it's been in years. Gartner's 2026 CMO spend survey puts marketing budgets at 7.8% of company revenue, which is effectively flat for the 3rd straight year in a row. 56% of CMOs say they don't have enough budget to execute their 2026 strategy. So the pressure to ask for more is real, and it's nearly universal. And then there's that stat that should stop you cold. In February, Gartner also predicted that more than 40% of CMOs who push for larger brand budgets actually lose influence with the C-suite because they're asking for more without being able to demonstrate clear ROI for their ask. I want you to listen to that again. Not won't get the budget. They'll lose influence. They'll ask that the ask itself, made without translation, made without making that connection between what they're doing and revenue, actively costs you standing, which tracks perfectly with the Lippincott data that we dug into a few weeks ago that said only 28% of CMOs feel they have real organizational influence, and 13% aren't even the top marketing decision maker in their own company anymore. So the standard play, walk in, show the activity, ask for more, isn't just failing, it's compounding the problem. Every untranslated task and every untranslated ask teaches the C-suite that marketing and communications are cost centers that speak a foreign language. But flip that around and you'll see the opportunity because it's enormous. And you know I love a good challenge dressed up as opportunity. If most of your peers are losing influence by asking, the pro who walks in speaking the business's native language doesn't just protect the budget, they stand out immediately. The bar is, truth be told, on the floor. So here's the reframe that this whole episode hangs on. The wrong conversation is, how do I convince the CEO that my work matters? The right conversation is, how do I translate what we do into the numbers the CFO already runs the business on? Because your CFO is not hostile. I know it can feel that way when they're redlining your program while nodding along to another 7 figures of AI spend. But CFOs are not anti-marketing or communications. They're anti-untranslated. They run the business on a small set of numbers, and they're personally on the hook for those numbers. And when you report reach, impressions, engagement, and share of voice, you're handing them homework. You're asking the busiest skeptic in the building to do that translation for you. They're not going to do it, not because they're lazy, but because it's not their job. It's yours. And when nobody does the translation, the CFO does the only rational thing. They fund what's already translated, sales, product, and yes, AI, and trim what isn't. Your budget doesn't get cut because the work is bad. It gets cut because they don't understand what the heck you do. I have good news though. The CFO's language is not that hard to learn. They are really only 4 words in it: pipeline, risk, retention, and cost to acquire. Every budget line the CFO defends without blinking maps to one of those: pipeline, risk, retention, or cost to acquire. Your job before the meeting is to map your work to the same 4. I know that some of our work can't be mapped to those 4 things, and consumer businesses don't map in the same way, but I do have a solution for you based on the business that you're in. So for pipeline, the untranslated version is, we earned 47 media placements and 14 million impressions last quarter. Wah, wah. The translated version is 60% of the deals that closed this quarter touched our content or our coverage before they ever talked to a salesperson. Here are the 3 media placements that showed up in actual sales conversations. Same work, completely different meaning. The first sentence describes activity. The second describes how the work you do affects revenue. And it's more within reach than you think. If your channels are connected, you can trace the path from an AI answer or an earned media mention to the owned asset it cited to the hand raised at the end. That is the credibility loop close rate we covered in the metrics episode probably 2-ish months ago. The one metric in our arsenal that connects visibility to trust to action in a single line. Pipeline is its native habitat. The untranslated version for risk is, we need to invest in thought leadership and brand reputation. Yes, of course, we do. To a CFO though, So the translated version is, when something goes wrong, a pricing mistake, a layoff, white collar executive, bad behavior, a bad review cycle, the cost of that day is set by how much credibility we banked before it happened. Here's what our current narrative coverage looks like. Here's where we're exposed, risk, and here's what that exposure costs if it's tested. CFOs are professionally fluent in risk. It's arguably their first language, and communications is the only function in the building that manufactures the asset that reduces reputational risk: a coherent, credible, well-distributed narrative. You're not a nice to have here. You are the insurance policy, and unlike most insurance, you actually appreciate in value. And there's a brand new risk category almost nobody at the table is managing yet: what the AI tool says about your company when you're not in the room. More on that in 2 weeks. It deserves its own episode. Next is retention, and the untranslated version is our newsletter open rate is up and our community is growing. The translated version is customers who engage with our owned content renew at a higher rate than those who don't. Retention is the cheapest revenue we have, and this is the machine that keeps customers believing what they believed when they bought. Here's the thing that nearly every marketing and comms program misses. We build everything for acquisition, and then we act surprised when the CFO points out that most of this year's revenue comes from existing customers. Your content, your community, your education, your executive visibility, they don't stop working after the deal closes. They're the reason the customer still believes the story at renewal time. Measure that, and you've attached yourself to the number that the CFO loses sleep over. And lastly, the cost to acquire untranslated version is our organic reach is growing, so we're less dependent on ads, which may very well be true. Yay. The translated version is every point of authority we build lowers what we pay for attention. Branded search, direct traffic, AI citations, inbound referrals. These are customers we didn't have to buy. Here's our cost to acquire on system-driven pipeline versus paid-driven pipeline. That's very important. System-driven pipeline versus paid-driven pipeline. Last week, I showed you how HubSpot lost 3/4 of its blog traffic and still grew their revenue by 19%. Because 2 decades of authority meant the business was never renting its audience in the first place. That is this number at scale. When you lead with paid, you're renting attention at whatever the platforms decide to charge this quarter. When an integrated system is adopted, acquisition costs decline each year. A CFO understands that trade in about 9.2 seconds. Okay, before you get all excited and turn your results report into 4 bullet points that address pipeline risk, retention, and/or cost to acquire, there are some pitfalls you want to be aware of. Translation requires integration and connection. You cannot claim pipeline for a blog that nobody routes to sales. You cannot claim retention for content that no customer sees. You cannot claim acquisition efficiency when paid, earned, shared, and owned media are 4 teams that meet once a quarter to share calendars. This is the through line of everything we've covered so far this summer. A measurement problem is almost never a measurement problem. It's the first place a disconnected system shows up. The peso model earns its keep in this exact meeting because when owned feeds earned feeds shared, and paid amplifies what works, the work produces traceable outcomes. An operating system that feeds itself is also conveniently an operating system that can prove itself. So if you map your budget to the 4 numbers and find you can't honestly connect the dots yet, that is totally fine. Trust me, you are in, everybody is there. Like almost nobody does this, almost no one. Don't skip the meaning. Instead, say, here's where the system connects, here's where it doesn't, and here's what it costs to leave it disconnected. And then you have some work to do. Actually, you have 3 things to be exact. First, go learn the numbers your CEO and CFO are on the hook for right now. Not in general, right now this quarter. If your organization is public, you can read the last earnings call. All of the anxieties are all there in the analyst Q&A. Throw it into your favorite AI and ask it to analyze it from that perspective for you. If you're a private organization, ask the CEO, ask the CFO. I'm continually amazed by how few have ever asked their CFO, what number are you most worried about this year? It's 1 question, it's free, and the answer is the outline for your entire budget presentation. This is exactly what I did on day 1 of those $40,000 strategy assessments, and it's the reason day 2 ever got funded. It's also the question I asked the one entrepreneur in front of his team, which he freaked out about. Apparently, he didn't want any financial transparency, but that has happened only once in more than a decade. Second, map every line of your budget to one of the 4 numbers. Every campaign, every retainer, every tool goes to pipeline, risk, retention, or cost to acquire. And here's what will set you apart. Anything that maps to nothing, cut it yourself. Cut it before you're asked to, before the meeting. You walk in with, I've already reallocated the 15% of our budget that wasn't earning its keep, buys you far more credibility than any chart in your deck because you've just demonstrated you manage the budget the same way the CFO would. Now the conversation isn't whether you should have money, it's whether you should have more money. More money. Give me more money. I'm stupid. And then third, present one traceable story rather than 12 metrics. One deal that closed with the earned placement the buyer mentioned on the first call. One customer who renewed with the own content trail behind the renewal, or one bad news cycle that didn't become a crisis and the credibility bank that's the reason why. Executives give more budget for the things that they can follow. A single story with a visible path through your work will outperform your entire dashboard because the dashboard requires them to trust the math and the story lets them see it. And if you do all of that, speak the language, make the cut, tell the story, and someone still blows up at you like my Chicago entrepreneur, then you've learned something else valuable about that room and no framework would have saved it. But that guy is rare, I promise. Most CFOs aren't hostile at all. They've just been sitting across the table for years, waiting for someone from our side of the house to finally show up on day one. Be that person, and the budget conversation stops being something you survive. It becomes the meeting where you win. If you would like to learn more about how to tell the measurement story to your CFO, join us in the SpinSups community. It's a great place to get advice, brainstorm ideas, and build real relationships with your peers. You can find us at spinsups.com/community. That's spinsups.com/community. And make sure you follow us on LinkedIn, TikTok, and Instagram. We're posting tips, how-tos, cheat sheets, and more every week. I'll see you next week. Bye.